The sun was just beginning to set when John Reynolds checked his email one last time before heading to bed. The soft glow of his laptop screen lit up his tired face as he scrolled through the usual mix of junk mail and work notices. Nothing important, he thought, ready to shut down for the night when a new message arrived with a ping. The sender's name made his heart skip a beat. It was from his old unit commander. John clicked it open and felt the world slow down around him. His old friend and fellow soldier, Mike Torres, had been killed in action 2 days ago. The words blurred on the screen as John blinked hard, trying to make sense of what he was reading. No, he whispered to the empty room of his small apartment. Not Mike. They had served 3 tours together. Mike was the guy who always had a joke ready when morale was low, who carried extra water for others when the desert heat became unbearable. He was only 26. John read further. Mike's parents were requesting that he, as Mike's closest friend from the unit, escort their son's remains home for the funeral. It was one of the highest honors a soldier could perform for a fallen comrade, and one of the hardest. Without hesitation, John replied that he would do it. He would bring Mike home. The next morning, John woke before his alarm. He hadn't really slept much anyway. His mind kept drifting to memories of Mike, their training days, the nights spent talking about home while on watch, the promises they'd made to visit each other's hometowns when they got out. John made coffee and called his boss at the construction company, where he'd been working since leaving active duty 2 years ago. "I need some time off," John explained, his voice steadier than he expected. "Military duty." His boss, a veteran himself, understood immediately. "Take whatever time you need. We've got you covered here." The Military Affairs Office sent detailed instructions to John's email within hours. Mike's remains would arrive at Dover Air Force Base the following day. John would need to be there to receive them and accompany them on the journey to Mike's hometown in Oregon. That evening, John carefully pressed his dress blues uniform. Every crease had to be perfect, every button polished to a high shine. He worked meticulously, focusing on the task to keep his mind from wandering to darker places. The uniform had been hanging in his closet since his last military funeral, something he had hoped not to wear again for a long time. As he arranged his service ribbons and badges, he found himself talking to Mike as if his friend were in the room with him. "Remember when you lost your dress cap right before inspection?" John chuckled softly. "You were running around like crazy looking for it, and then the sergeant found it being used as a coffee cup holder." The memory brought a smile to his face, but it faded quickly. There would be no more new memories with Mike, just the old ones that John would have to hold on to. John barely slept that night. He lay awake thinking about Mike's parents. They had always been so proud of their son. Mike was the first in his family to join the military, and he had done it with such conviction. How do you face parents who have lost their child? What could he possibly say to ease their pain? By dawn, John was already up and getting dressed. He moved with the precision that had been drilled into him during his years of service. Each movement was deliberate, respectful. This wasn't just about wearing a uniform, this was about honoring Mike in every possible way. The taxi ride to the airport was quiet. The driver, noticing John's uniform, asked if he was heading somewhere important. "I'm going to bring my friend home," John replied simply, not trusting himself to say more. The flight to Dover was uneventful, but John's mind was anything but calm. He thought about the family waiting in Oregon, about the duty he was about to perform. It was a responsibility that weighed heavily on him, but also one he was determined to carry out perfectly. Dover Air Force Base was busy when John arrived. He identified himself at the gate and was escorted to the Mortuary Affairs building. The staff there greeted him with solemn respect. They understood what he was there to do. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, a lieutenant, greeted him, extending his hand. "Thank you for doing this. Private Torres' remains arrived an hour ago." John nodded, his throat tight. "When will the transfer ceremony take place?" "Tonight at 1900 hours. You'll stand witness as he's transferred to the transport case. Tomorrow morning at 0700, you'll accompany him to the commercial airport for your connecting flight to Oregon." John spent the rest of the day going through briefings about his duties as an escort. Though he had done this once before for another unit member, The mortuary affairs officers reviewed every detail with him: the proper handling of the transfer case, the protocols for transportation, how to interact with airline personnel, what to expect at security checkpoints. Throughout it all, John remained composed, taking in every piece of information. This would be done right. He owed Mike that much. That evening, John stood at attention on the tarmac as a transport plane's cargo door opened slowly. Several service members in dress uniforms emerged, forming a line. Then came the flag-draped transfer case carrying Mike's remains. The sight hit John harder than he expected. This wasn't just any fallen soldier. This was Mike, his friend who had talked endlessly about the fishing boat he was saving up to buy, the guy who kept a photo of his dog inside his helmet, the soldier who had pulled John to safety when their convoy was hit 3 years ago. The honor guard moved with slow, measured steps as they carried the transfer case down the ramp. John maintained his salute, his arm perfectly straight, despite the ache building in his shoulder. The moment demanded nothing less than perfection. Later that night, alone in his temporary quarters on base, John finally allowed himself a moment of grief. He sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and let the tears come. No one was there to see him break, to see the weight of loss finally crack his carefully maintained composure. "I'm bringing you home, buddy," he whispered. "Just like I promised." Morning came too quickly. John was up before dawn, once again donning his dress blues with careful precision. Today was the day he would begin the journey to deliver Mike to his family. The base chaplain met John at the mortuary affairs building. Together, they stood in silence as the transfer case was loaded into the vehicle that would take them to the commercial airport. "Would you like to say a prayer before we depart?" the chaplain asked gently. John nodded. He wasn't particularly religious, but Mike had been. It felt right to honor his friend's faith. The chaplain spoke softly, words of comfort and safe passage. John listened, eyes fixed on the flag-draped case before him. In that moment, he renewed his silent promise to Mike. He would complete this mission with the honor and dignity his friend deserved. The drive to the airport was filled with a heavy silence. John sat next to the driver, occasionally glancing back at the transfer case secured in the vehicle. It still didn't seem real that Mike was gone. Part of him expected to get a call saying there had been a mistake, that Mike was actually alive, and well, and wondering what all the fuss was about. But there was no mistake. And now John had one final duty to his friend, to bring him home to the family who loved him, who were waiting to say their final goodbyes. As they approached the airport, John straightened his uniform one last time and prepared himself for the next leg of the journey. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. For Mike, for the promise he had made. Some duties went beyond orders or obligations. Some were sacred, and bringing a fallen brother home was the most sacred duty of all. The morning air felt crisp as John stepped out of the military vehicle at the airport entrance. He adjusted his uniform cap and nodded to the driver who had accompanied him from Dover Air Force Base. A small team of airport ground staff was already waiting, standing respectfully to the side as the military honor guard unloaded Mike's flag-draped transfer case from the vehicle. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, a middle-aged man in an airport operations uniform, stepped forward. "I'm Tom Wilson, the airport liaison for military transfers. We've been expecting you." John shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for your assistance." "We're honored to help, Sergeant. If you'll follow me, we've arranged for a private area for the transfer and check-in process." John walked alongside the honor guard as they carefully moved Mike's transfer case through a side entrance, away from the busy main terminal. He noticed how people stopped and fell silent as they passed. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others offered small nods of respect. A few veterans stood at attention and saluted. Inside the private room, John reviewed the paperwork with the airline representative. The woman, whose badge read Patricia, handled everything with quiet efficiency. "We've notified the flight crew about your escort duty," she explained. "You and Private Torres will board first and deplane last. The captain will make an announcement during the flight, if that meets with your approval." John nodded. "It does. Thank you." Patricia's eyes softened. My brother served 2 tours in Afghanistan. This means a lot to all of us here. With the paperwork complete, John watched as the transfer case was carefully loaded onto a special cart for transport to the plane. He would not let Mike out of his sight. That was the promise he had made. Security was the next step. TSA had a special protocol for fallen service members. TSA agents worked with unusual solemnity, several of them offering quiet words of condolence to John as he stood by. "Staff Sergeant, we're ready to proceed to the gate," the lead TSA agent finally said. The walk through the terminal was unlike anything John had experienced before. Word had somehow spread about what was happening. Travelers stopped their hurried rushing, creating a path through the crowded terminal. Many stood in respectful silence. An older gentleman removed his hat and placed it over his heart. John maintained his military bearing, walking with measured steps beside the cart carrying his friend. Inside, his emotions churned, but his face revealed nothing. This moment wasn't about him. It was about Mike, about showing the world that those who make the ultimate sacrifice are brought home with honor. At the gate, the ground crew was waiting. The gate agent made a quiet announcement to the waiting passengers, explaining that they would be witnessing a dignified transfer and asking for their patience and respect. John watched as the transfer case was carefully loaded onto the plane before any passengers boarded. Then he took his own seat in the front row where he could maintain a clear line of sight to the cargo hold. As other passengers filed past, many stopped briefly by his seat. "Thank you for your service," one woman whispered. "God bless him and his family," said another. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap simply placed his hand on John's shoulder for a moment. No words needed between them. The flight itself was unusually quiet. Halfway through, the captain's voice came over the intercom, informing the passengers that they were transporting a fallen hero and asking for a moment of silence. John stared straight ahead during those long seconds, feeling the weight of 200 strangers joining him in honoring Mike. When they landed for their connection in Chicago, John was the first to exit the plane. He stood at attention on the jetway as the ground crew carefully unloaded the transfer case. This process would repeat itself. The solemn walk through the terminal, the respectful distance kept by travelers, the dignity of the transfer to the next aircraft. But Chicago's airport was much busier than the previous one. The crowds were thicker, the pace more hectic. As John followed the honor guard through the terminal, he noticed a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, what's that? Why is everyone stopping?" the boy asked loudly. His mother knelt down beside him. "That's a fallen soldier, honey. Someone who died protecting our country. The man in uniform is bringing him home to his family." The boy looked at John with wide eyes, then straightened his small shoulders and raised his hand in an unpracticed but earnest salute. John returned the salute formally, the simple gesture cutting through his professional composure for just a moment. He blinked rapidly and continued forward. They had a 2-hour layover before the final flight to Oregon. John used the time to call Mike's parents, something he had been both dreading and feeling compelled to do. "Mrs. Torres, this is John Reynolds." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "John," the woman's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing our boy home." "It's my honor, ma'am." John swallowed hard. "We're in Chicago now. Should be arriving in Portland around 6 p.m. your time. We'll be there waiting." There was a pause. Was he a good soldier, John? "He didn't tell us much about what it was like over there, always said not to worry." John looked across the terminal, watching travelers rush past, oblivious to the conversation that was breaking his heart. "He was the best, Mrs. Torres. Everyone in the unit looked up to him. He saved lives over there, mine included." John hadn't planned to share that, but it felt important that she know. There was a soft cry on the other end of the line. "Thank you for telling me that. It helps somehow." After ending the call, John found a quiet corner of the airport to collect himself. Conversations like that never got easier. What could you possibly say to parents who had lost their child? No words seemed adequate. Time passed slowly, until finally it was time to board the last flight. This plane was smaller than the previous one, a regional jet that would carry them the final distance to Mike's hometown. The process began again, the careful loading, the respectful boarding, the quiet acknowledgments from passengers. As they reached cruising altitude, John allowed himself to gaze out the window. The landscape below was changing, becoming the green hills and forests of the Pacific Northwest. Mike had talked about this place constantly, describing fishing trips with his dad, hiking adventures with friends, the small town where everyone knew everyone else. "You've got to come visit when we get out," Mike had told him once during a particularly long night watch. "My mom makes the best apple pie you've ever tasted, and my dad knows all the good fishing spots." John had promised he would someday. Now he was keeping that promise, but not in the way either of them had imagined. The flight attendant stopped by his seat, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "Can I get you anything, Staff Sergeant?" she asked quietly. John shook his head. "No, thank you." She hesitated. "The crew wanted me to tell you. We're all honored to be part of this flight. If there's anything at all you need, please just ask." "I appreciate that," John replied. As the plane began its descent toward Portland, John prepared himself mentally for what was to come. The Torres family would be waiting. There would be a local honor guard as well. The final transfer from the plane to the hearse that would take Mike to the funeral home. He thought about the dress blues uniform hanging in Mike's closet at home, the one he would be buried in, about the folded flag that would be presented to Mrs. Torres, about the rifle salute that would crack the air at the cemetery. All the rituals designed to honor sacrifice, to bring some small measure of dignity to unbearable loss. The plane touched, down with a slight bump. John remained seated as the other passengers deplaned, many of them nodding respectfully to him as they passed. Only when everyone else had left did he stand and make his way to the front, where the ground crew was already preparing to unload the transfer case. Standing at the door of the plane, John could see them waiting on the tarmac below. A middle-aged couple standing close together, Mike's parents. The mother was clutching her husband's arm, her face already wet with tears. Behind them stood a young woman who looked so much like Mike that she had to be his sister. Beside the family was the local honor guard standing at perfect attention despite the wind that whipped across the airfield. John descended the steps slowly, maintaining his military bearing. When he reached the bottom, he approached Mike's parents and came to attention, offering a crisp salute. "Mr. and Mrs. Torres," he said formally. "Staff Sergeant Jonathan Reynolds. I've brought your son home." Mrs. Torres stepped forward and did something that broke military protocol but spoke to something deeper. She hugged John tightly. "Thank you," she whispered against his uniform. "Thank you for bringing him back to us." John stood rigid for a moment, then allowed his arms to close around her briefly. Some rules could bend in the face of such grief. Behind them, the ground crew was carefully unloading the transfer case. The local honor guard moved into position, ready to carry Mike the rest of the way home. This part of the journey was ending, but John knew the hardest part was still to come. Tomorrow would bring the funeral, the final goodbye. But for now, he had fulfilled his promise. He had brought Mike home, with all the honor and dignity his friend deserved. As the honor guard lifted the transfer case, John fell into step beside them. The wind had died down, as if even the elements were paying respect. In the distance, John could see airport workers standing with hands over their hearts. Nearby, a small crowd had gathered. Friends and extended family of the Torres family, come to welcome home their fallen son. John glanced up at the sky, at the setting sun painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. It was a beautiful evening, the kind Mike would have appreciated. "We're home, buddy," John whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "We made it." The Portland airport terminal felt different from the others John had passed through. Smaller, more personal somehow. Mike had often said that Oregon was like that. Everything felt a bit closer, a bit more connected. John had smiled at that description back then. Now he understood. After the emotional meeting with the Torres family on the tarmac, John had expected to hand over his escort duties to the local honor guard. That was typically how these things worked. But Mrs. Torres had asked him to stay, to be part of the funeral tomorrow. "You were his brother in everything but blood," she had said, her eyes still wet with tears. So John found himself checking into a small hotel near the funeral home, his dress blues carefully hung in the closet for tomorrow's service. He sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly at a loss. For 2 days he had been focused entirely on his duty, bringing Mike home with dignity. Now, in the quiet of the hotel room, the reality of his loss hit him all over again. John pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo he'd been avoiding looking at. His unit gathered around a makeshift Christmas tree they'd set up at their forward operating base last year. Mike stood in the center, a lopsided Santa hat on his head, grinning that infectious grin of his. John remembered how Mike had somehow acquired small gifts for everyone, little things that meant nothing and everything, all at once. A knock at his door pulled John from his me. Maury's. He opened it to find Mike's father standing there looking uncertain. "Mr. Torres," John said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" The older man nodded. "Call me Robert, please. I wondered if you might want to get some dinner. Lisa, my wife. She's with our daughter and the relatives, and I just needed—" He trailed off, not finishing the thought. John understood immediately. Sometimes grief was too heavy to bear alone, but too personal to share with a crowd. "I'd like that, sir. Give me just a minute." They found a quiet diner a few blocks from the hotel. It was the kind of place Mike would have loved, unpretentious, with hearty food and friendly service. They sat across from each other, two men connected by someone who was no longer there. "He wrote about you in his letters home," Robert said after they'd ordered. "Always John this, John that. Said you were the steadiest person he'd ever met." John looked down at his coffee. "He was a good friend, the best." "Were you there when it happened?" The question hung in the air between them. John shook his head. "No, sir. I left active duty 2 years ago. Mike had another year on his contract." He hesitated, then asked the question he'd been carrying since he got the news. "Did they tell you how it happened?" Robert's face tightened. "An IED. They said it was quick, that he didn't suffer." He stared out the window for a long moment. "I keep thinking about when he was a boy. He broke his arm falling out of a tree when he was 10. Cried all the way to the hospital. But when the doctor asked about his pain level, he straightened up and said, 'I'm fine, sir.' Always so brave even then." John smiled despite himself. "That sounds like Mike." They talked through dinner, Robert sharing stories of Mike's childhood, John offering glimpses of the man Mike had become in the service. It wasn't always easy conversation, but it felt necessary, sacred even. As they walked back to the hotel, Robert stopped suddenly. "Lisa and we want to thank you properly for bringing him home. But I don't know how. There aren't words for this kind of thing." John looked at the older man, seeing echoes of Mike in the set of his jaw, the way he held himself. "Sir, it was my honor. That's not just something I'm saying, it truly was." Robert nodded, understanding passing between them. They parted at the hotel with a firm handshake that said what words couldn't. That night, John slept fitfully, dreaming of desserts and explosions, of flag-draped coffins and Mike's voice calling out for help. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the hotel room disorienting him for a moment, before reality settled back in. The funeral was set for 11 a.m. John rose, early, giving himself plenty of time to prepare. Each movement as he donned his dress blues felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. This uniform had seen too many goodbyes. At 10:30, John arrived at the funeral home. The parking lot was already filled with cars, and a small crowd had gathered outside. Some wore military uniforms. Others were in civilian clothes but stood with the unmistakable bearing of veterans. Word had spread quickly in this small town that one of their own was coming home for the last time. Inside, John found the Torres family in a small private room. Mrs. Torres, Lisa, embraced him again. Mike's sister Anna shook his hand with a grip that revealed her struggle to stay composed. And there were others, aunts, uncles, cousins, all with Mike's eyes or smile or laugh. "We'd like you to sit with us," Lisa said. In the family section, John hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," Anna said firmly. "Your family. Mike would want you there." The service itself was a blur of hymns and prayers, of tears and somber faces. A local pastor spoke of sacrifice and duty. Robert shared memories of his son that made the congregation laugh through their tears. Anna read a poem she had written for her brother, and then it was John's turn to speak. He hadn't prepared anything formal, had thought he would simply be there as an escort, but Lisa had asked him last night and he couldn't refuse. John approached, the podium slowly, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes on him. He cleared his throat. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. "Mike was always better at finding the right words. He could make you laugh on the worst days, could remind you what we were, fighting for when it seemed pointless." John paused, gathering himself. "We called him Doc in our unit, even though he wasn't a medic. It was because he could fix anything. Equipment, arguments between soldiers, homesickness. He fixed me once after a bad firefight left me questioning everything. Just sat with me all night, talking about fishing of all things, about the streams back home where he'd go with his dad, about how the world keeps turning, keeps being beautiful even when terrible things happen." John looked at the flag-draped coffin before him. "Mike saved my life once, physically pulled me to safety under fire. But he saved something more important, too. He saved my belief that good people exist, that kindness matters even in war. Especially in war." Across the church, heads nodded in understanding. John saw veterans wiping away tears, recognized the particular grief of those who had stood where he stood now. "I don't have the words to explain what Mike meant to all of us who served with him, but I can tell you this. We're better men because we knew him, and we won't forget him. Not ever." John stepped down, returning to his seat beside the Torres family. Lisa squeezed his hand silently. After the service came the procession to the cemetery. John rode with the family, the silence in the car broken only by occasional sniffles or whispered memories. Outside, John could see the town had come to a standstill. People lined the streets, hands over hearts or offering salutes as the hearse passed. American flags flew from porches and storefronts. At the cemetery, a military honor guard waited. John joined them for the final rituals, the careful removal of the casket from the hearse, the solemn march to the gravesite, the positioning of the flag. The day had turned unseasonably warm, the spring sun beating down as the chaplain offered final prayers. John stood at perfect attention despite the heat, sweat running down his back beneath his uniform. Physical discomfort seemed a small price to pay in this moment. The rifle salute came next, 3 volleys cutting through the quiet of the cemetery. John saw Lisa flinch at each crack, saw Robert's arm tighten around her shoulders. Then the haunting notes of taps filled the air, played by a young soldier whose cheeks were wet with tears even as he maintained the melody. Finally came the flag ceremony. John and another soldier removed the flag from the casket, folding it with precise, practiced movements into the tight triangle that would be presented to the family. Each fold had meaning, for country, for duty, for sacrifice. As the ranking officer present, John was given the honor of presenting the flag. He approached Lisa, the folded flag extended in his white-gloved hands. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." The formal words felt simultaneously inadequate and profound. Lisa took the flag with trembling hands, clutching it to her chest as if it contained some essence of her son. With the official ceremony complete, people began to drift away, heading to the Torres home for the reception that would follow. John remained at the gravesite, waiting until the family had a moment alone before he would join them. As the crowd thinned, John noticed a young woman standing apart from the others, watching the proceedings with red-rimmed eyes. There was something familiar about her, though John was certain they had never met. She approached him hesitantly. "You're John, aren't you? Mike's friend?" John nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Kelly. Mike and I were dating, since he came home on leave last Christmas." She twisted a ring on her right hand nervously. "He talked about you a lot, said you were the brother he never had." John felt his throat tighten. Mike had mentioned a girl in his last few letters, but he hadn't gone into details. "I'm sorry for your loss." Kelly nodded, blinking rapidly. "He was going to get out after this tour. We had plans." She stopped, unable to continue for a moment. Was he happy over there? As happy as anyone can be in that situation, I mean. John considered his answer carefully. He found purpose in what he did, and he was looking forward to coming home, to starting the next chapter. He talked about it all the time. It wasn't exactly what she had asked, but it was the truth Mike would have wanted her to hear. Not the hard days, the fear, the moments of doubt, but the hope that had carried him through. Kelly seemed to understand what John wasn't saying. "Thank you for bringing him home. And thank you for being his friend." She pressed something into John's hand, a small fishing lure. "He would have wanted you to have this. It was his lucky charm." Before John could respond, she walked away, shoulders straight despite the grief she carried. John stood alone by the gravesite, the small lure in his palm catching the sunlight. Tomorrow, he would fly back home, return to his job, his apartment, his life. But something would be different. Something was always different after you said goodbye to a friend this way. He tucked the lure carefully into his pocket and turned toward the waiting cars. The Torres family would be expecting him at the house. There would be food and drink, stories and tears, the communal sharing of grief that somehow made it both more bearable and more real. John took one last look at the casket, still suspended above the open grave. "Goodbye, brother," he said softly. "Resty. See now." Then he walked away, carrying Mike's memory with him, another weight added to those he already bore. Such was the cost of loving someone who wore the uniform. Such was the price of brotherhood. The day after the funeral dawned gray and drizzling, as if the Oregon sky was sharing in the collective grief. John woke early in his hotel room, his mind already running through the day ahead. His flight back home wasn't until late afternoon, which left him with hours to fill in a town where every street corner now seemed to hold the ghost of Mike's stories. John showered and dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt. After 2 days in his dress blues, the casual clothing felt strange, almost disrespectful somehow. But the formal part of his duty was complete. Now he was just a man saying a final goodbye to a friend's family before heading home. He had breakfast in the hotel restaurant, picking at eggs he didn't really want while checking messages on his phone. There were texts from his boss expressing condolences, from former unit members who had heard about Mike, from his sister asking when he'd be home. The ordinary world continued turning, oblivious to the hole that had been torn in it. As John was signing his check, his phone rang. It was Robert Torres. "John, good morning. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, sir," John replied. "I was just finishing breakfast." There was a pause before Robert continued. "Lisa and I were wondering if you might have time this morning to stop by the house. There's something we'd like to show you before you leave." "Of course," John said. "I can be there in half an hour if that works for you." "Perfect. We'll see you then." John paid his bill and stepped outside into the light rain. He decided to walk to the Torres home, which was only about 15 minutes away. The wet air felt good on his face after the stuffy hotel room, and the physical movement helped calm his thoughts. The Torres house was a tidy 2-story with a wide front porch and American flag hanging beside the door. Yellow ribbons had been tied around the porch columns, and a small memorial wreath hung on the front door. John paused at the bottom of the steps, taking a deep breath before climbing to the porch and knocking. The door opened almost immediately. Lisa Torres stood there, looking both exhausted and somehow lighter than she had yesterday. The initial shock of grief had passed, leaving in its wake the quieter pain that would become her companion for months and years to come. "John, thank you for coming," she said, stepping back to let him in. Robert's in the kitchen making coffee. The house was warm and lived in, with family photos covering the walls. John couldn't help but look for Mike's face among them. There he was as a gap-toothed kid with a fishing pole, as a serious teenager in a football uniform, as a proud young man in his military dress uniform. Robert appeared from the kitchen, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "Good morning, John. Cream or sugar?" "Black is fine, thank you," John replied, accepting the mug. "Let's sit in the living room," Lisa suggested, leading the way. The living room was cozy, with well-worn furniture and more family photos. A display case held Mike's high school football trophies, and bookshelves lined one wall. John sat in an armchair while Robert and Lisa took the sofa across from him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Robert cleared his throat. "We wanted to thank you properly for what you did, bringing Mike home with such dignity. The military sent an escort as a matter of protocol, but you came as his friend. That means everything to us." John nodded, not trusting himself to speak right away. Lisa leaned forward. "Last night after everyone left, we were sitting here talking about Mike, about what he would want. And we remembered something." She looked at her husband. Robert stood and walked to a small desk in the corner. He returned with an envelope, which he handed to John. This was in a box of things Mike asked us to keep for him when he deployed. There was a letter addressed to us, in case he didn't come back. But there was this too, with your name on it. John stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in Mike's familiar handwriting, slightly messy, with the J made just a bit too fancy. A running joke between them about Mike's artistic penmanship. "We didn't open it," Lisa said softly. "It's yours." John held the envelope carefully as if it might dissolve in his hands. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rough. "Why don't you take a few minutes?" Robert suggested, understanding in his eyes. "The den is down the hall if you'd like some privacy." John nodded gratefully and followed Robert's gesture to a small room lined with bookshelves. A desk sat beneath, a window that looked out onto a backyard where John imagined a young Mike had played. Alone in the den, John turned the envelope over in his hands several times before finally opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly. John unfolded it slowly, revealing Mike's handwriting once more. "Hey, John," the letter began. "If you're reading this, I guess I screwed up and didn't make it home. Sorry about that." John let out a soft laugh despite himself. It was so typically Mike, making a joke even now. "I'm not good at serious stuff, you know that better than anyone. But there are some things I need to say just in case. First, thank you. For being the best friend a guy could ask for pulling me through the bad days, for making me a better soldier and a better man. Second, I need a favor. My folks, and they're going to take this hard, real hard. They've never been good at letting go. If you're reading this, it probably means you're the one who brought me home. Watch out for them, a little, will you? Just a call now and then. They're good people and they'll need good people around them. Third, remember that talk we had on Night Watch about what it all means? About whether what we were doing mattered? I still believe it does. Even if this is how my story ends, I believe it was worth it. Don't let anyone tell you different. Especially yourself. Last thing, that fishing trip we always talked about? Take it. Go to that lake up north I told you about. Catch a big one for me. Stay frosty, brother. I'll save you a seat at the big barracks in the sky." Mike John stared at the paper for a long time, reading the words over and over until they blurred before his eyes. He could hear Mike's voice saying them, could see his half grin as he made that stupid joke about the big barracks in the sky. After a while, John wasn't sure how long, there was a gentle knock at the door. He quickly wiped his eyes and cleared his throat. "Come in," he called. It was Anna, Mike's sister. She looked so much like her brother that it made John's chest ache. "Mom sent me to check on you," she said, hovering in the doorway. And to tell you lunch is almost ready, if you'd like to stay. John carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. Thank you. I'd like that. Anna nodded, then hesitated. Can I show you something before we go back to the others? Of course, John replied, standing. It's upstairs, Mike's room. John followed her up a narrow staircase to the second floor. Anna paused outside a closed door, then pushed it open. Inside was clearly a teenager's room preserved in amber, posters of bands and athletes on the walls, sports trophies on shelves, a twin bed with a blue comforter. Mom hasn't changed anything since he enlisted, Anna explained. I think she always feared, well, that he wouldn't come back to change it himself. John stood in the doorway, not quite willing to step into this private space, but Anna gestured him forward. Look at the bulletin board, she said, pointing to a corkboard above the desk. John moved closer. The board was covered in photos, ticket stubs, and other mementos. But what Anna was pointing to was a photo in the center, John and Mike in their combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like idiots despite the dust and exhaustion evident on their faces. John remembered when it was taken, after a particularly difficult mission that had ended better than anyone expected. Sent that home in his first letter from deployment, Anna said. Told us you were the best man he'd ever known, that if anything happened to him, you'd make sure he got home right. John swallowed hard. He was the best of us, he said simply. Anna nodded. He was good at seeing the best in people. She touched the photo gently. Thank you for being the person he believed you to be. Before John could respond, she turned and headed back downstairs, leaving him alone with the ghost of his friend. Lunch was a quieter affair than John had expected. Just the Torres family and himself around their dining table. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, Anna's college classes, the garden Lisa was planning for summer. But Mike was present in every pause, every glance at his empty chair as the meal wound down. Robert refilled coffee cups and Lisa brought out a pie. Apple, she said, placing a slice in front of John. Mike's favorite. John smiled. He used to talk about your apple pie all the time, said it was worth walking through fire for. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling too. He always was prone to exaggeration. Not about this, I promise, John said after taking a bite. This is amazing. They ate dessert, sharing more stories about Mike, funny ones now, that had them laughing through their tears. It felt right somehow, this mixture of grief and joy, of remembrance that honored both the loss and the life that had been lived. After lunch, John helped clear the table despite Lisa's protests. It was nearly time for him to head to the airport. His suitcase was already in the rental car parked outside. I should get going soon, he said reluctantly. Robert nodded. We understand. But know that you're always welcome here, John. You're family now. The word hit John harder than he expected. Family. It had been just him and his sister for years now, their parents gone. The idea of this extended family, bound not by blood, but by love, for Mike was both painful and precious. Thank you, he said. That means a lot. Lisa disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small package wrapped in waxed paper. For your trip, she explained, handing it to John. Just some sandwiches and a slice of pie. Airport food is terrible. John accepted the package, understanding it for what it was. A mother's need to care for someone when she could no longer care for her son. I'll call when I get home, John promised, and I'll stay in touch if that's all right. We'd like that very much, Robert said. There were hugs and a few more tears, and then John was in his rental car, driving away from the Torres home. He glanced in the rearview mirror to see them standing on the porch, arms around each other, watching him go. The drive to the airport was quiet, the rain having stopped to leave behind a sky of broken clouds and patches of blue. John thought about Mike's letter in his pocket, about the promises it contained. He would keep them all, the calls to Mike's parents, the fishing trip, the belief that what they had done together mattered. At the airport, John returned the rental car and checked in for his flight. He had just enough time to grab a coffee before boarding, though he wasn't particularly thirsty. He just wanted to sit for a moment, to transition from these days of grief and duty back to his regular life. As he sat at the small airport cafe, John noticed a group of soldiers in the corner, easily identifiable by their haircuts and bearing even in civilian clothes. They were young, so young that John felt ancient by comparison, though only a few years separated them. One of them caught John's eye and nodded in recognition of a fellow service member. John nodded back. Words weren't necessary. Some bonds were, understood without explanation. His flight was called and John gathered his carry-on bag. As he walked to the gate, he felt Mike's letter in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the promise he had made. He would carry it with him always, just as he would carry the memory of these days. The solemn duty, the shared grief, the unexpected family he had found. The airplane waited on the tarmac, a different kind of transport than the one that had brought Mike home. John would return to his life, changed in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. But he would carry forward the legacy of his friend, the courage, the kindness, the belief that doing the right thing mattered, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. 3 months had passed since John had brought Mike home. Summer had settled over his small town, bringing with it long, warm evenings and the rhythmic sound of sprinklers on lawns. John had fallen back into the routines of civilian life, work at the construction company, weekend beers with local friends, occasional calls with former unit members who understood what he had lost. On his refrigerator door hung a photo the Torres family had sent him, a shot from the funeral reception showing John with Mike's parents and sister, their faces, tired but at peace. Beside it was a child's drawing, brightly colored and barely recognizable as a person in uniform. It had arrived in the mail a week after John returned home, accompanied by a note from a teacher explaining that her second-grade class had been at the airport when John had escorted Mike's transfer case through the terminal. One of her students, deeply moved by what he had seen, had drawn this picture of the soldier who brought his friend home. John looked at these reminders every morning as he made coffee, a daily ritual of remembrance that somehow made the loss easier to bear. He had kept his promise to stay in touch with the Torres family. Weekly calls at first, then settling into a comfortable rhythm of every other Sunday evening. They talked about ordinary things mostly: Robert's garden, Anna's summer internship, Lisa's church activities. But sometimes they talked about Mike, too, sharing memories that kept him alive in their hearts. One warm Friday evening in July, John was just finishing up at the construction site when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Torres's name. "Hello?" John answered, his stomach tightening. The calls usually came on Sundays. A change in pattern might mean bad news. "John, it's Robert. How are you, son?" The familiar voice eased John's concern. "I'm good, sir, just finishing up work for the week. Everything okay with you folks?" There was a pause, then Robert spoke again. "Yes, we're doing all right. Actually, the reason I'm calling, well, Lisa and I were going through some more of Mike's things, and we found something we think you should have. It's his fishing gear. All of it. The rods, the tackle box, everything." John leaned against his truck, caught off guard by the offer. "Sir, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Robert interrupted. "You know how much fishing meant to him. And we remember all those stories he told about teaching you to fish properly someday." There was a smile in Robert's voice now. "He said you were hopeless, but he figured he could save you from yourself." John laughed softly, remembering Mike's constant teasing about John's city boy ignorance of proper fishing techniques. "He wasn't wrong. I'm pretty hopeless." "All the more reason you should have his gear," Robert said. "He'd want you to use it. Specifically, he'd want you to use it at Silver Lake." John's breath caught. Silver Lake. That was the spot Mike had always talked about, the place mentioned in his final letter. "Take that fishing trip we always talked about." "I remember him talking about that lake," John said carefully. "It was his favorite place in the world," Robert replied. "We scattered some of his ashes there last month. It felt right." John hadn't known about that private ceremony. It touched him deeply that the Torres family had honored Mike's love for that place. Lisa and I were thinking, Robert continued after a moment, that maybe you might want to come out here next month. Stay a few days. I could take you up to the lake, show you Mike's favorite spots. The invitation hung in the air, weighted with, meaning beyond a simple fishing trip. This was about honoring Mike's wishes, about continuing bonds that death had altered but not severed. I'd like that very much, John said simply. Good, Robert replied, the relief evident in his voice. We'll work out the details over the next few weeks. After ending the call, John sat in his truck for a long time, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The idea of visiting Silver Lake stirred complex emotions. It would be a way to fulfill the promise in Mike's letter, to honor his friend's final request. But it would also make the loss real in a new way, acknowledging that these experiences would never be shared with Mike himself. The weeks passed quickly, and soon John found himself on a plane to Oregon once. Again, this time there was no transfer case to escort, no dress uniform hanging in his carry-on, just a duffel bag of casual clothes and the weight of memory. Robert met him at the airport, his weather-worn face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of John. They embraced briefly, the gesture no longer awkward between them. Good to see you, son, Robert said, taking John's bag. Lisa's got dinner waiting at home. Hope you're hungry. She's been cooking all day. The Torres home felt different this time, lighter somehow, though still marked by loss. Photos of Mike remained prominent on the walls, but there were new ones too. Life continuing, as it must. Lisa hugged John tightly when he arrived. You look good, she said, stepping back to examine him. Have you been sleeping better? John nodded, touched by her maternal concern. He hadn't told her about the nightmares that had plagued him after returning home, but somehow she had known. Much better, yes. Dinner was a lively affair, with Anna joining them and bringing her boyfriend, a quiet engineering student who clearly adored her. They ate on the back patio, surrounded by Robert's flourishing garden. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. After dessert, apple pie of course, Robert brought out a faded photo album. Thought you might want to see these, he said, opening it to reveal photos of a much younger Mike, fishing pole in hand, standing beside a pristine mountain lake. Silver Lake about 15 years ago. His first big catch. John studied the photos, seeing the boy who would become the man he knew, the same determined set to his jaw, the same light in his eyes. He looked so proud, John observed. Wouldn't stop talking about that fish for months, Lisa recalled, smiling at the memory. You'd have thought he'd caught Moby Dick himself. They spent the evening looking through albums, sharing stories that painted a fuller picture of Mike's life before the military. John found himself laughing more than he had in months, the grief giving way to a different kind of remembrance, one that celebrated rather than mourned. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for their trip to the lake. Robert loaded Mike's fishing gear into his truck while John helped Lisa pack a cooler with sandwiches and drinks. You boys be careful up there, Lisa said as they prepared to leave. And John? She touched his arm gently. Thank you for doing this. It means more than you know. The drive to Silver Lake took nearly 2 hours, winding through forests that grew denser and mountains that rose higher with each passing mile. Robert pointed out landmarks along the way, the diner where they always stopped for breakfast, the viewpoint where they'd taken family photos, the stream where Mike had caught his first fish at age 6. He loved it up here, Robert said as they turned onto a gravel road that led deeper into the forest. Even as a teenager, when most kids his age wanted nothing to do with their parents, he'd still beg to come fishing with me. John watched the scenery pass by, trying to see it through Mike's eyes. The towering pines, the glimpses of snow-capped peaks, the occasional deer darting across the road. He could understand why his friend had loved this place so fiercely. Silver Lake appeared suddenly as they rounded a bend, a vast expanse of crystal-clear water nestled between steep forested slopes. The morning sun sparkled on its surface, creating a dazzling display that gave the lake its name. It's beautiful, John said softly. Robert nodded, parking the truck in a small clearing near the shoreline. Mike always said there was no place on Earth that felt more like home to him than right here. They unloaded the truck in comfortable silence, setting up their gear on a flat rock that jutted out into the water. Robert handled Mike's fishing rods with practiced care, running his fingers along the worn grips where his son's hands had once rested. This was his favorite, Robert said, handing one of the rods to John. He saved up for months to buy it when he was 16. John accepted it carefully, feeling the weight of both the physical object and what it represented. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. Robert simply nodded, understanding in his eyes. They spent the morning fishing, Robert patiently teaching John the techniques Mike had always teased him about. The older man was a good instructor, just as his son had been in other contexts, firm but kind, quick to praise small victories. Around noon, they took a break, settling on the rocky shore to eat the sandwiches Lisa had packed. The lake stretched. Before them, peaceful and timeless. "We came up here right before his last deployment," Robert said, breaking a long silence. "Just the two of us, fished all day, then sat around a campfire half the night talking." He gazed out at the water. "I think he knew, somehow, that it might be his last time here." John thought about his own last conversation with Mike, about the letters he had written just in case. "He was always more aware than he let on," John observed. "Made jokes, played the class clown, but he saw things clearly." Robert nodded slowly. "That last night here, he told me that if anything happened to him, he wanted some of his ashes scattered in this lake. Said part of him would always belong here." He glanced at John. "We did that last month. Just the family. It was hard, but right." John looked out at the sparkling water. "Thank you for telling me." They fell silent again. The only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of an eagle. John felt a profound sense of peace settling over him, as if the mountain air was clearing away the last lingering weight of grief. After lunch, they returned to fishing. John, applying the morning's lessons, managed to catch a decent-sized trout, earning a proud nod from Robert. "Mike would be giving you hell right now." Robert laughed as John somewhat clumsily removed the hook from the fish's mouth before releasing it back into the lake. But he'd be pleased too. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather over the distant peaks. Robert eyed them with the wariness of an experienced outdoorsman. "Mountain storm coming," he observed. "We should probably start packing up soon." John nodded, reeling in his line for the last time. As he turned to begin collecting their gear, something caught his eye. A flash of color against the gray-green forest on the opposite shore. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. A figure in a red jacket stood at the tree line, just visible in the fading light. For one impossible moment, John's heart stopped. The stance, the way the person stood with weight shifted to one side, it was so achingly familiar. Then the figure turned and disappeared back into the forest, and reason reasserted itself. Just another hiker, enjoying the lake as they had been. Nothing more. But as John helped Robert load the truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't been alone out there. That somehow, in some way, Mike had been with them. They drove back, down the mountain as the first raindrops began to fall, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Neither man spoke much, each lost in his own thoughts. Near the bottom of the mountain road, Robert pulled the truck over at a small roadside memorial, a simple stone marker surrounded by American flags and fresh flowers. "Local boy," Robert explained. "Killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. His parents put this up so people would remember." John looked at the memorial, at the young face etched into the stone. Another life cut short, another family left to gather around photographs and memories people do remember, John said quietly. "Those of us who served, we remember them all." Robert nodded, understanding in his eyes. After a moment, he put the truck back in gear and continued down the mountain. When they arrived back at the Torres home, Lisa was waiting on the porch, concern evident on her face as she watched the storm clouds rolling in behind them. "Just in time," she called as they hurried to unload the truck before the rain hit. "Did you catch anything?" "John did," Robert replied, pride in his voice. "Nice trout. Would have made a good dinner if we'd kept it." Lisa smiled. "Well, I've got beef stew that's been simmering all day, so I think we'll manage." The evening passed comfortably, the three of them sitting in the living room as rain pattered against the windows. John shared stories about his job, about his plans to use his GI Bill benefits to take some college courses in the fall. Lisa talked about the community garden she had helped start, about how working with the soil had become a kind of therapy for her. As the night grew late, Robert disappeared into the basement and returned with a dusty bottle of whiskey. "Mike and I were saving this for a special occasion," he explained, pouring 3 small glasses. "I think tonight qualifies." They raised their glasses in a silent toast. No words were necessary. They all knew who they were drinking to, who was present in their hearts if not in the room. Later, as John prepared for bed in the guest room, he noticed something on the nightstand that hadn't been there the night before. Mike's old tackle box, battered and worn from years of use. A note sat beside it, written in Lisa's neat handwriting. "John, this belongs with you now. Mike would want you to use it, to remember him in the places he loved. Thank you for being his brother when he needed one most. You will always be family to us, Lisa and Robert." John ran his fingers over the tackle box, feeling the scratches and dents that told the story of countless fishing trips, of a life well lived if too brief. Inside, he knew, would be the lures and hooks Mike had collected over the years, each with its own story. He would take it home with him, this tangible piece of his friend's life. He would learn to use it properly, would return to Silver Lake someday, would keep the promises made, both spoken and unspoken. Outside, the storm was passing, the rain softening to a gentle patter. John went to the window and looked out at the clearing sky, at the stars beginning to appear between the clouds. Somewhere out there, perhaps on another night patrol in another desert, young men and women were keeping watch, were forging the kinds of bonds that transcended time and distance and even death, the kind of bond he had shared with Mike. John thought about the journey that had brought him here, not just the physical journey of escorting his friend home, but the emotional one that had followed, the grief that had threatened to overwhelm him, the duty that had sustained him, the unexpected family that had embraced him. He had brought Mike home with honor, had stood by his family in their darkest hour, but they, in turn, had given John something equally precious, the knowledge that while death might end a life, it could not end love, that bonds formed in the crucible of service created a kind of family that existed beyond blood or name. As John finally turned away from the window and prepared for sleep, he felt a sense of completeness that had been missing since the day he received that fateful email. Mike was gone, yes. But in this house, by that lake, in the memories they shared and the stories they told, he lived on. And in carrying his friend home, John had found his own way forward, one step at a time, one memory honored, one promise kept. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a sky full of stars shining down on the small house where grief had slowly, steadily given way to healing, where a fallen soldier was remembered not just for how he died but for how he lived, and where those who loved him continued his legacy in their own quiet, determined ways. It was enough. It would have to be enough. And somehow John knew it was exactly what Mike would have wanted.